Hello, Ben.
Hello.
Thank you for agreeing to do this interview. My name is Mosunmola Ogunmolaji, and I'm from the Summer Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Today is April 11th, and we are at the village in Gainesville, and I'm interviewing Mr. Ben. We're just going to start out with like some basic questions. Could you tell us what is your full name and could you spell it out for us?
Well, my full name is Benjamin Franklin Dyal. Do I need to spell it? Benjamin Franklin Dyal.
Thank you. And when were you born and where were you born?
I was born in Woodbine, Georgia on 8 October 1944.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, early childhood, where did you grow up and what was that life like for you?
I grew up in Woodbine, and as I always tell people when they ask, what was it like growing up in the South in the 50s and 60s? I say, have you read To Kill a Mockingbird? That is as good a picture of a small southern town as I can think of. And it was very much like that. Yeah.
Do you have any fond recollection as a child growing up in Georgia?
Oh, yes. Good heavens.
Yes. Could you share?
Swimming, eating, being with other people. I don't remember any. Well, I mean, we had birthday parties, we had parties. There were all sorts of things going on in a little town to keep people from being too bored, which we were anyway.
Do you want to share some of your, adventures, perhaps the swimming adventures or any other one that comes to mind?
Well, one of my uncles owned a farm outside Woodbine, and he had cattle and horses, and we used to go there, and there were a couple of ponds that we swam in, probably full of alligators. Thinking about them now, I think I wouldn't dream of getting in those ponds now, but in those days we did. But we never saw an alligator. I suppose we frightened them away, all the noise we made. But I went to elementary and high school in Camden County, which is where Woodbine is. Church played a big part in people's lives, not in a evangelical way, but just a lot of social life revolved around people you knew at church and people you got to know. My family was mostly Methodist, although since later, when I was in college, I became Episcopalian. And anyway, so.
Yeah, thank you. You started out by referring to your uncle. Could you tell us a little more about your family background? So your parents, perhaps your grandparents too as well.
Well, I never knew any of my grandparents. They all died before I was born. My mother was the daughter of a sheriff, and my father was the son of a successful businessman. And my uncle, that particular uncle, had graduated from Auburn. Somebody got my family hooked on Auburn a long time ago, and so my father went there. He didn't graduate, but he went there. Various uncles went there, and so there was a connection. I'm not sure how that came about to begin with, but anyway, this particular uncle whose farm we went to a lot, had worked for an oil company. He was an engineer, and he'd worked for an oil company in Venezuela, and also in his engineering job, which I think he was a civil engineer, in Iceland, building some kind of air base or something, and later on in Ecuador. So he had what I remember, once he came back from Ecuador, and he brought my sister and me a present. And the present was a shrunken head. And I think it was a real one because it had a terrible smell, and my mother wouldn't allow it in the house. I do remember that it was around Halloween, and they told us to bring something to school that was related to Halloween. So we brought, my sister and I took the shrunken head, and it was pretty gross, actually. I mean, it was a shriveled up brown thing. I have no idea whether it was truly a shrunken head or not, nor did my uncle, but it had a terrible smell. And so it soon disappeared. I'm not going to accuse my mother of getting rid of it, but anyway.
Thank you for sharing that, that interesting story. Could you also tell us like your parents' name and perhaps that of your uncle, if you'd like?
My parents'
Their
name and
names.
what?
Their names.
Well, my father's name was the same as mine. I was named after him. He was named after an uncle. My mother's name was Inez, and my father had 6 brothers and 2 sisters, and my mother was one of 5. So we grew up with a lot of cousins, and not all of them lived in Woodbine, of course. They lived in various places, but as Deborah can tell you, once you get that sand in your feet, people come back, and certainly people that have been brought up there. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So still talking about your childhood and all of that, what was life like growing up, like with your parents and also with your family generally? What was that
Well,
like
it was all very comfortable and open, and not. It was a very nice childhood. I mean, growing up in a small town. Of course, those were the days of segregation and separate drinking fountains and things like that. And but I do remember going once somewhere and drinking from the wrong fountain. And somebody, not my mother or father, I don't know who it said, no, you can't drink from there. You have to drink from the white fountain. And so anyway, you could not be unaware of that growing up in the South in those days. Now, I have to say, there is something very strange about that county. Deborah probably, in that county, even when I was a child, now we're going back to the 50s, black people voted. People who were in politics, like my grandfather and later on one of my uncles, always tried to get what they called the black vote, because they did vote. And I mean, now in other counties in South Georgia, I think that was not the case. I had some friends from Western Georgia, and black people didn't vote there. But they did in Camden County. Now, don't ask me why, and I'm not trying to put Camden County up as any sort of liberal beacon or light in darkness, because it certainly wasn't. But it is, when I thought about it later in my life, I thought, well, that was strange. And there was never any question about it. I never remember. Now, I was not aware of anybody turning black people away, but I do remember that there was a voters list for whites and for blacks, and it was, people checked their names off and were allowed to vote.
That's quite interesting.
It is interesting, and I know other people from Georgia, South Carolina, in the South, and they say, well, no, that wasn't that way. And even now, in some places, they try to keep white people and black people who are from voting. Anyway, okay.
I was going to ask you why anyway, but I'm glad you said I shouldn't ask why.
well, yeah, I don't know why.
Yeah.
It's something that I know that happened, and it's strange. As I said, I can't explain it.
Okay. I think another thing I would also ask about your family is do you have any like famous or infamous family stories that, you could share with us? Or perhaps like songs associated with your family?
I don't think I do. When my
Okay.
father and his brothers got together, the conversation could get pretty raunchy and very amusing. I had another uncle who, my father's oldest brother, graduated from Georgia Tech in 1920 or something. I don't know about the year, but he got a job in Central America with United Fruit Company initially, and stayed there for many years. And he would come back every couple of years, and he always brought pictures, and he always brought candy for my sister and me. So of course we looked forward to his coming. And this was strange too. He was married, and his wife lived in another small town, Douglas, as a matter of fact. But she never went to South America with him, to Central America with him. And somebody in the family said, "Well, why don't you take her there?" And he said, "It's no place for a lady." And the retort came, "Well, is it a place for a gentleman?" So, yes. I'll come back to that particular uncle later. He comes into something else, but just keep him in mind.
Okay.
When I'm...
I'm not sure if you mentioned his name earlier on.
His name was Oliver.
Okay. Yeah, I keep that in mind. Let's move on to your educational background. What was it like, going to elementary school?
All right. Well, again, we're in a small southern town before air conditioning. It was very hot. Are you all comfortable? I think I've got the air conditioner on. Are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me know if you're not, and we can make it colder or hotter or whatever. Anyway, it was not a one-room schoolhouse. No, it was a proper school with different grades. Actually, Deborah may know this. Our elementary school was not in Woodbine; was at a place called White Oak. Do you know White Oak at all? It's between Brunswick and Woodbine. It's one of those. It's even more than Woodbine. If you blink twice, you'll probably miss it. You did miss it, but there was a school there, and I don't know why. But we rode the bus there. The high school was in Woodbine, a county high school, and I graduated from there, and then went to Emory at Oxford College for 2 years, and then to the University of Georgia, and I graduated there with a degree in English Lit, or English. It was Lit anyway.
Yeah. And during your elementary school and high school days, what was that like, making friends in school and the teachers?
Well, the teachers were mostly friends of my parents because it was a small town. So, if you misbehaved, you could be sure it was going to be reported. The news of your misbehavior would get home before you got there, and you'd be greeted at the door, "Well, what did I hear today about you?" Anyway, very much that way. And of course, the high school was different, but in elementary school, for sure. Mm-hmm. What was the rest of that question?
Yeah, and making friends in high school.
Well,
education.
Everybody in those days that I was in school with, in elementary school, lived in Woodbine, so we knew those children, and it wasn't. It was very rare that strange children came in, because it was not a place where people moved to unless they had a job or something, and not many of those. the main livelihood in those days was timber, paper mills and supplying paper mills and buying and selling timber and pine trees and all that kind of business. There was in the county a big mill in a town called St. Mary's, which, anyway, yes.
In what year did you start your element, or
I graduated from high school in 1962.
Okay.
And I went to college in the 62, that same year. I mean, graduated in June and went to college in
1962. Okay. So moving on to your tertiary education, going to the University of Georgia, what did you study at the University of Georgia?
English.
English language.
I started to study English and French, and when it came time to graduate, I was short a credit, and I had to take a course, and there was a course in English or a course in French, and I thought it would be easier since it was in the summer to take the English one, so that switched my, my major became English. I could have gone either way, but anyway, so.
So it wasn't like there was something that inspired you to study English. It was just.
I always loved reading. And I had aunts and uncles that they read all the time and encouraged us to read. And I mean, you see, we had some big bookcases in our house and full of books. Many of them not read very often, but they were always there. And I remember my parents reading a lot, and we were encouraged to read. And I had aunts and uncles who did the same thing. No, I hear it.
So just a question about, going to the University of Georgia in the 1960s. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I should mention something that, because this is important. I had a friend, we had met at Epworth by the Sea, which she knows is a Methodist camp on St. Simon's, is it? Yes. Anyway, it was a 5-day camp, a church camp, and people from all over South Georgia came there. And I can't remember what happened there. I remember one thing that happened that was very important. I met this young man or child, a boy, who became a good friend of mine, and he a very close friend, and his name was John, Jon, Spence, Spence, and he was from another small town in Georgia, over in West Georgia, called Camilla, Camilla. Okay. He was at the University of Georgia. We were there together. We roomed together for a while, and then he joined a fraternity and moved into the fraternity house. But he was also an English major. And when I met him when we were 12 years old, I did not know anybody who was enthusiastic as I was about reading. And he was, and we immediately hit it off at 12. And he was, and one thing that I remember about that initial meeting was we were exchanging addresses, because, okay, you can write to me and we'll get a correspondence going, which we did. And I said, well, what's your address? And he said, Box 225, Camilla. I said, amazing. My address is Box 225, Woodbine. So it was just a strange meeting. Anyway, we remained friends up until 2011 when he died. Anyway, he may come into the story again because we were great friends.
Yeah, so could you tell us a little bit about, him, going to school with him and him being your friend? What was sort of like?
Well, can I? Let's leave the university and
Okay.
get to when I graduated in 1966,
Okay.
and I'm trying to stay remotely chronological because I've got my note there. No, you don't have to listen to me in my order. Okay. And in 1966, the danger of being drafted and going to Vietnam was very great. And people were doing all kinds of things to avoid that. Now, my draft board had given me a deferment through college. Okay, very kind of them and whatever. And then, as I was about to graduate, you start looking around, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me? Well, the Peace Corps was just getting started then. And so I got in touch. You know, those days people wrote letters, Mosunmola, no internet, no immediate whatever. Anyway, it's all done by mail, and it worked in those days. Anyway, and so I ended up going into the Peace Corps. And again, my draft board gave me a deferment for 2 years, which was the time I was going to spend in the Peace Corps. And I went for training. There was a training. I was going to Malawi, which is in East Africa. You probably know.
Yeah.
It's not a small country, but anyway. And let's see, where was I going with that? We went to Malawi, and I was assigned to teach English in a teacher training college. In other words, I was teaching young men, as it happened, no women, or they had another college, I think, young men who were going to be elementary school teachers. So they knew some English, but you know, not a lot and not very well. Anyway, and I was in a place where I was the only Peace Corps volunteer, and it was a wonderful experience. I found I really liked teaching, and looking back, some of the things I taught, after some years of experience, you realize, oh, you thought that was brilliant at the time, but in fact it was idiotic. We've all had teachers like that, I'm sure. But anyway, I had a very satisfactory experience in the Peace Corps, very, very much. I think it was formative. I was completely on my own. Now, when I say completely on my own, there were some South African missionaries there as well. Not that I got really involved with them, but I knew they were there. And I was on friendly terms with them. But anyway, now, okay, after the Peace Corps, this is like 1968, the end of 1968, I left the Peace Corps, of course, 2 years was the time you signed up for, and came back to the States. My father had died, and I was wanted to spend some time with my mother, anyway, and which I did. And I even taught for a short time in the high school there that I had graduated from, a very short time, and that was not a happy experience because I'd come from Africa where the students were very respectful and wanted to learn, to the United States where the students were not respectful and did not want to learn. Well, anyway, it didn't matter. I was rescued from this by the draft board, who I guess just figured, we've given him 2 deferments, it's time for him to go. So I was drafted. and ended up, well, I ended up initially, first, they sent me to Germany, which I liked because you were in the middle of Europe. You would get on a train and go all sorts of places, Paris, Rome, all over. I was in Germany. And so, and people said, oh, nobody ever gets sent from Germany to Vietnam. Well, I did. Anyway, so I went to Vietnam, and do you want to hear what I did in Vietnam?
Absolutely.
Okay. In those days, when soldiers were going somewhere, they had a sort of file that had all their personnel records and everything. These days, I'm sure it's all done by by computer. Anyway, okay, we arrive in Vietnam, and for a couple of days, we were at what was called a receiving station, where people were coming into the country, American soldiers, and also leaving. Anyway, it came time for us to go with our files and let somebody tell us where we were going. And I was in a group of people, and there were about 10 in this group. When I say group, we had just become friends in the Army. I hadn't known them before, but they were all people who had gone to Eastern colleges. I mean, in New England, Dartmouth, Rutgers. I don't think there was anybody from Harvard, but those schools anyway. And we were all in a line, and I think I was the last one in the line. And as those people stepped up, there was a sergeant sitting at the table looking at the things, and to the person at the head, he would look and say, and grab an M16 and say, take this and go stand over there. So there were about 8 or 10 people that happened to before it got to me. And I was thinking, well, obviously I'm going to go over there. However, when he got mine, oh, are you an English major? Did you major in English? I didn't know whether to admit it or not. And I said, yes. And he said, you want to write letters for a general? As if I had a choice. But it sounded better than take this weapon and go stand over there. So, of course, I said yes. Mm-hmm. And ended up going there, going to what was called a headquarters company, where a commanding general was, that he needed somebody to write letters. And what were the letters? This is the part that's so interesting, and I should have saved all these things, but I didn't. Anyway, the letters that I wrote were to members of Congress whose constituents had written to them complaining about something wrong in Vietnam. You know, I should not be here. I'm the only son of my mother, and she's a widow, whatever, which was true. Okay, my job was to take these things, these letters, because what happened, the person would send the letter to the member of Congress. The member of Congress would then pass it to somebody in the Pentagon, and it would go down the chain of command until it got to the unit where the man was a member of, and somebody would have to investigate and write the letter explaining what was going on. Okay, and there were some very strange things, but anyway, my orders were, you must write a letter which the commanding general can sign, the commanding general of this logistical command, and which, if it appeared on the front page of the New York Times, would not cause any embarrassment. So I learned to play with words, as politicians do. I've never had any ambition for to be a politician. But anyway, of course, I would get the information, then I would have to investigate, which sometimes meant calling the writer of the letter in to find out what was the story. And my favorite kinds of letters, and this is not, be prepared for, this is going to not be very pleasant. Some people wrote letters like, "Dear Senator Kennedy, get me out of here. My commanding officer is a motherfucking son of a bitch." Which I have no doubt was true. And my sympathy was completely on the side of the writer. But, sorry for that, but that's exactly what happened. And I worked under a captain who knew no more about English writing than I know about civil engineering. Anyway, and he would always give me the letter and say, "Now answer all the allegations." "Well, Captain Snow, the allegations here are pretty serious, and I have no way of checking them out." But a lot of times, most of the letters were much easier to deal with than that. Some disciplinary problem, or there were people who had been drafted and should not have been drafted. And anyway, that's a bit of that story. So, and I was there for a year. And then I came back to the States very disillusioned about America and what it stood for and what it was doing. And I remember one person, I can't remember what his complaint was, but he came in and he said, "These people are shooting at me. I don't even know them and they don't know me." That kind of thing was not easy to deal with, sorry. Anyway, after I came back to Woodbine after that, after being discharged from the Army, and my friend John and his wife were in London. He was studying at University of London. And they said, "Oh, we'll come over here, we'll have a good time." Well, I went, and we did have a good time. But after a while, I had a very bad habit, eating. And, my supply of money was finite. But, when you're in your 20s, you just have a good time and, "Oh my gosh, I don't have any money and I'm hungry." Okay, well, in those days, it's in the early 70s. In those days, there were all sorts of jobs available for people who had 2 years experience teaching English. And they didn't care if you were American or British, as long as you could speak English, which I could do. And I could even write it, as my time in Vietnam proved. Anyway, and so I went to London and stayed for a while with John and Betsy, his wife, and she had a job with Delta Airlines. They were both American, of course. I mean, she was American. Anyway, so I got a newspaper every day or two, and there were ads for teachers all over the place. And I just wrote several letters. One was to Nigeria. In fact, when I was in the Peace Corps, a lot of Peace Corps volunteers in Nigeria, that was the time of not a revolution, but
Civil War.
Civil War. And a lot of Peace Corps volunteers were taken out of Nigeria because it wasn't felt it was safe, and some of them came to where I was. Anyway, that's just by the by, might be of interest to you. I can't remember where they were from in Nigeria, but I'm sure you know. Anyway, so I got a letter back I was in London, got a letter back from a place in Qatar, which now, these days, is quite famous, Qatar, Doha, where the World Cup was last year, or year before, anyway. And there was a lot of oil there, and you know, and they weren't looking for English teachers. I had no idea where it was. I had heard of the place, but I didn't know anything about it. Anyway, we did our research, John and I and his wife, and anyway, we found out where it was. And I went for an interview in Brighton, which is down south from London on the coast. Now, this sounds crazy, but it's the truth. I went down to Brighton and was to be interviewed by somebody. I arrived, of course, with proof that I was a graduate and had a degree in English and all this kind of stuff. And I was given an address to go to, and I went to it and was told, I mean, it was a business building, a building with offices in it. I went to the office. I rang the bell and I heard somebody say, "Come in." And I walked in, and there was a very distinguished looking Englishman sitting behind a desk. And when I had walked to the desk, he said, "Have a seat." And then he said, "How soon could you leave? How soon could you leave?" I said, "Well, how soon do you need? I'm ready." Okay, it wasn't that day, but it was like less than a week later, I found myself on a plane from London to, in those days, not direct flights to the Middle East, but from London to Amman, Jordan, and then from Jordan to Doha. Okay, and they never even asked to see my degrees or papers or anything. Strange. There were some experiences later with, I think they needed a new recruiter. He recruited some other people that were totally unsatisfactory for the job. And so anyway, but yes. And so I was dropped into the Arab Islamic world without really knowing much about it. But I was a quick learner, not stupid, had eyes open. And I also had the experience of having lived in Malawi, which was another place that was culturally completely different from what anything I was used to. And part of our training for the Peace Corps was to make you aware of these differences and to embed in your American minds that you were not better than those people, you were different. And they were not better than you, they were different. And you had to respect their culture and their ways of doing things. So that bit was not a problem for me. And I taught there for 4 years. And then I was offered a job in Saudi Arabia, which is right next door. It was a school which was it was not a boarding school. It was a day school, but mainly patronized by very rich Saudis and members of the royal family. That teaching experience, I lasted there for 2 years, and I didn't really like it. I mean, the students were nice, but and I liked living in Riyadh was fine. But again, they were like the Africans, very respectful of teachers and were well behaved. Although I do remember, now these were princes in Saudi Arabia. Mm. This was in the 1970s. So, I mean, they said to me one time, I was teaching a class of about 11th to 12th graders, and they said, "Mr. Ben, do you want to go to Egypt? I said, well, yeah, okay. I'd like to go to Egypt, but, I'm working. Oh, we're just talking about going for the weekend. Do you want to go with us? I said, well, I don't have a visa or anything. Oh, no problem. You could just go with us. These were all princes in the royal family. And indeed, that was one time when I didn't go with them because they went and guess what?
What?
They didn't want to come back after the weekend. So I would have been stuck there and would have no doubt gotten fired from my job. Anyway, I didn't go. They went and had a good time. And another story along those lines, I had, of course, a class list. And it came time for the test, for the final exam. And there were people on the list that I had never seen before, had never been to class. And I remember one of them, I called his name and he said, that's me, in perfect American English. He'd been living in the States. I said, well, are you going to take the exam? He said, don't worry, I'll pass. And he did. Well, of course, he'd been in the States. But, had never bothered to come to school, but came for the exam. So, anyway. Later jobs in Saudi Arabia involved teaching in military, writing curriculum, teaching people in oil company, all sorts of things like that. But I never went back to a secondary school again. I taught in college. I taught medical students English, not medicine, of course. And anyway, okay. Stop a minute, please. I taught all sorts of students in Saudi Arabia from the phone company. My last job in Saudi Arabia was teaching air traffic controllers, which was interesting. They were all interesting, and I liked the people, got along with them, and I did not live on a compound. If I wanted to live on a compound, I would have stayed here and lived in some town like Woodbine or Brunswick or St. Simons, and but I enjoyed the stimulation of being in a different place and a different culture. We're jumping around here, but I should tell you this. I mentioned Uncle Oliver and his working in Central America. Mm-hmm. After I came back from the Peace Corps, I remember he and I were going somewhere. I don't know how that happened. It doesn't really matter. But he said to me, did you enjoy your time in Africa? And I said, yes, I did, very much. And he said, would you go back? And I said, yes, I would. And he said, would you take another job in a foreign country? I said, yes, why not? And he said, be careful, not for your safety, but you stay there too long and you'll be out of touch with your own people, which of course, looking back, was exactly what had happened to him. Mm-hmm. He had gone there and stayed for 30 years or something. Of course he came back and on leave and things like that. And, let's be honest. I'm sure he probably had a mistress down there, which I don't care about. It's fine with me. And even one of my aunts asked him one time if he had any children down there. And anyway, that's the kind of family I'm from, where people ask these questions. He did not give a yay or a nay answer. But anyway, I've often thought he had gone down there and built a life for himself, working there. And he obviously liked it because he stayed a long time, over 30 years, and like me in the Middle East. And the difference was he retired, I think, in the late 50s and came back to live in the States with his wife. They had one son who, anyway. But when I came back from the Middle East, it was the days of the internet. I could keep up with people and find out what was going on and what they were doing and so forth. He had, when he came back in the late 50s, it took 2 weeks to get a letter. I mean, when I was in Malawi, I'd write a letter and, maybe a month later I'd get a response. When I first went to Saudi Arabia, it was 2 weeks for sure. And that was if you sat down immediately and answered the letter. And anyway, communication was something completely different from today. No Facebook, not any of that stuff. Anyway, and I'm sure Uncle Oliver must have missed things about living in Central America, which today he could have been on the internet or Facebook or WhatsApp or all of those things and kept up with people. But I'm sure he did feel a bit cut off from things. I mean, you can spend 30 years somewhere. I felt cut off when I came back from Saudi Arabia. But I came back because I was sick and in fact had cancer. That's how I'm here in Gainesville. I came to Gainesville because of the VA hospital, and I have to say they've done a fine job with me. I mean, I'm here, I'm alive, and at one point, when I came here to the village in 2013, I had just almost died. I had chemo, and it cured the cancer, but it made me very sick, and ended up spending 6 weeks in the hospital here with some kind of strange pneumonia, which initially anyway, I'm here. And I don't remember a lot of that. Thank goodness I was out of it. One thing I do remember is I was in the ICU for a while, and I asked the nurse why those birds were flying around in the room. Of course, there were no birds there at all. I was delirious. And I said, do you think I ought to tell the doctor? And she said, no, I don't think so. He might put you in a place worse than this. So that's about all I remember from it. I did wonder, people kept coming to see me, and I wondered why. I was glad to see them, of course. I was in the hospital. I later found out that they thought they were coming to bid me farewell. They weren't never going to see me again. But I fooled them. So.
Yeah, so you've given us a very good overview of your experiences from, after you left the University of Georgia and you went on the Peace Corps. So I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Just going to take you back a little bit.
Sure.
I think the first is about your experience in Malawi. So how would you describe your experience generally within those 2 years with interacting with the people? Did you pick up any language?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't call myself a linguist, but I like languages, so yes. Mm-hmm. And part of our training to go to Malawi was in the language, which was in those days called Chinyanja, which today is called Chichewa. It's the same language, they just changed the name. Because the Chewa were the big tribe, main tribe, and so they named it after them. And the leader of Malawi was a member of that tribe, and so they changed the language. Exactly the same. It's a Bantu language. Anyway. But no, I mean, my students, when I was not working, they came in droves to my house to talk and, whatever. It was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot about them and about their culture and what was going on. And of course, I was not in a town. This college was out in the middle, was 10 miles from any town. No, more than 10 miles because it was up on a mountainside, and we had to go down the mountain and then on a very rough road out to the main road, taking us 10 miles into town. And town was a very small place. It's now the capital, Lilongwe, but it was just very little town in those days. There was a hotel. There was an ice cream shop where we were told not to eat the ice cream because we'd be sure to get some dreadful disease. And I was tempted by a woman from California who said, I'm not staying here 2 years and not eating ice cream. So we went to the ice cream shop, and the man in the ice cream shop was an Indian. And we said, how long have you been in business? And he said, my father started this business 10 years ago. So we figured if he'd been in business for 10 years, it must be safe. I mean, if it's making people sick, the word's going to get out and nobody's going to go. So we both had some ice cream. Neither of us got sick. And that was my first, well, no, yes, it was my first intimation that sometimes the U.S. government could steer you wrong. So, anyway, yes.
Yeah. Talking about ice cream, did you, and then food generally, did you sort of, have to, get accustomed to like the local food?
Well, I have to confess completely. You know what fufu is?
Yes.
Okay, well, their main diet, it's made with corn, or corn. It's made in East Africa, made with corn, and it's sort of like a dough, and you eat that along with what they call a sauce. The sauce may be vegetables, maybe meat, maybe whatever. It's like eating a piece of bread. You dip it in and then eat it. I liked the sauce a lot. I was not very fond of that other stuff. It was just tasteless. They didn't have enough salt anyway. I couldn't change that, but I could tell them that the trick was to tell them you had an allergy to that. They would excuse you. But no, the food, I mean, I fell in love with mangoes there, and I've never gotten over that. Wonderful mangoes. And anyway, yes. Go ahead, next one. But no, I mean, I loved living in Malawi, and I mean, I thought at one time I could have stayed for another year, but because of my father having died and my mother, I wanted to be with her for a while, and so I left. I came back to the U.S., always knowing that at the first opportunity I was going to run away. Well, I first had to run away to Vietnam, which was not a place I would have chosen, but then after that, I did manage to get away and stayed away.
Thank you. One more thing about Malawi, though.
Sure.
Did you go out for social activities? Where would you typically go?
Well, because I was the only Peace Corps volunteer there, and there were a lot of South Africans, they invited me for meals and whatever. And they were living with families. In the place that I was, it was called a mission station. It had originally, if you know your African history, you probably do, that area was explored by David Livingstone, a Scottish, as in Dr. Livingstone, I presume, if people still know about that. Anyway, and it originally had been a mission station that was run by the Presbyterians from Scotland. Well, at some point, I don't know why or when or how, they gave it up and turned it over to a group from South Africa. And in this mission station where I was, there was the teacher training college, a theological college, a nursing school, and nursing school, and a hospital. And the hospital was quite famous because there was a South African doctor there who had studied in Europe and America and who was an expert cataract and eye person. So people came from all over Southern Africa to come there and get him to operate on them. And of course, in the college and in the there were other young people there, South Africans, and even some VSO. You know what VSO is? It's like the British version of the Peace Corps, VSO, voluntary service overseas in various countries, in Africa, Asia, all over. Anyway, so yes, there was a social life, and as I said, the students came to my house all the time. Anytime they had, well, of course, you go and talk to the foreigner. He'll tell you something crazy, and maybe we'll tell him something crazy. So, yes, it was a very, very good experience.
So moving on to your experience after you were drafted, and then going to Germany? You talked about that really rather briefly. What did
What
you do in Germany? You
in
said you were
where?
first enlisted to Germany, if I remember correctly.
I'm sorry.
Germany, that you had to go to Germany first before going to Vietnam.
Germany.
Oh, Germany.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, okay. In the I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
After in the Army, after we finished the training, and I trained as something called a communication specialist, which involved dealing with some kind of machines that I can't remember anything about because I never worked in that occupation. Anyway, I was sent to Germany as a communication specialist, and I was in a town called Worms, worms, but in German, Worms. And it had all sorts of connections with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, and it was a lovely little town. And I don't know why there was a communication center there, but that's where I was working. And of course, that was just like a regular job. You work from 9 to 5, and then we lived in a special sort of compound with American GIs. You could go out in the town and do what you liked. And the weekends, if you were free, you could get on the train and go anywhere, within a couple of hours away. It was pleasant. I would have been happy to stay there for 2 years, but Uncle Sam, if you know who he is, had other ideas. And so I got orders for Vietnam.
Did you travel to any other European country while you were?
Oh, yes. I went to
Okay.
France. I went to Italy. I was only there for about 6 months, but I made good use of the time, and different places in Germany as well.
That's great. So we talked about Vietnam in numbers. Okay.
Now, Vietnam was a place where I had almost no contact with Vietnamese. We lived on a compound, fenced off, guarded. We have to be guarded from the people we have supposedly sent here to protect. What's going on here? Uncle Sam, did you lie to me, or what is going on? And I mean, I was in contact with Vietnamese. There were Vietnamese who worked on the compounds, where the GI compounds, the American compounds. And I remember this was told to me. I didn't know it at the time. On Sunday, the Vietnamese they had a day off. They worked 6 days a week. Okay. On Sunday was invariably the day when our compound, with no Vietnamese on it, would get attacked by rockets. And the instructions were, if you hear the rocket, it's too late. You're gone. But if you have chance, get under your bed. Well, I was never in a place, rockets flew around, but I was never in a place where that happened. But of course, and there were so many contradictions. Where I worked, I lived in one place and worked in another place. And the other place that I worked was 4 or 5 miles, and we were right on the coast, Da Nang, right on the sea coast. And we went in a bus to work, like an old American school bus, a yellow bus, except it had all sorts of bars and wires and whatever, so that people couldn't throw hand grenades in and stuff like that. Never encountered that, but again, we're supposedly here doing something good, and people are trying to kill us. Something not right there. Anyway, Okay.
So it seems that like your perception of,
Well,
being enlisted into the army and going to Vietnam actually changed as a result of like you being
well,
there.
I mean, I had been brought up in a little southern town, and I mean, people that I knew had been in the Korean War, fathers of friends of mine, and my father was never, because he was too old and too young in the First World War and too old in the Second. And anyway, but so we heard stories, but World War II was a patriotic war. I mean, anyway, Vietnam opened the eyes of a lot of people. Now, I think it's important to note this. When I went to Vietnam, I had already been in the Peace Corps. I had 2 years experience in the Peace Corps, living in another country, being in contact with people who didn't think the way I thought. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. And most of the other people in Vietnam, most of the other soldiers, were young men from all over the country who had graduated from high school and been drafted. So I had not only college behind me, but so I had a little more experience, and my perceptions were different from many of theirs. I told you about the man who said, "Why they want to shoot me? I don't even know who they are." And yes, anyway. There's a wonderful, along those lines, there's a wonderful scene in Tolstoy's War and Peace when Nicholas Rostov comes back after fighting Napoleon and said, "Why do they want to kill me? I don't even know them. They might be nice people." Exactly the same thing. Could ask it today about a lot of places. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you also said you worked on the Commanding General. Do you recall his name? Would you like to share his name?
Yeah, he's probably dead now. His name was Arthur J. Sweeney.
Okay.
Sweeny, and we were in what was called a support command, and that means that we were involved with logistics, moving equipment from place to place. It might have been food, it might have been bombs, whatever it was. I mean, I was in an office. I had a picture of me somewhere in the office, which I couldn't find, so you'll have to do without it. But anyway, it was a normal office. Should I mention anything about drugs in Vietnam?
Sure, if you would like to share.
Well, I mean, those people who were out in what was called the bush, meaning not in a town, but living rough and swamps and everything else, who could possibly object to their smoking marijuana or whatever, to forget how miserable they were and how terrible it was. And I did my share as well, but I didn't have that reason for doing it. Just as a recreational drug with people in Vietnam. I think that's enough about that. But no, the general who was commanding. Now, between me, the writer, and the general, there were several layers that the letter had to go through. And, they would call me out on things, and it would come back to me, and, they would suggest a change. And occasionally they suggested a grammatical change, which I would not give up on. I knew better grammar than they did. But anyway, and amusing thing, I only talked to General Sweeney one time. And I'll tell you what the circumstances were. There was a need for American teachers to teach English to Vietnamese pilots. Okay, all right. And at the time, I was in Vietnam in 1971. At that time, there were 2 people in Vietnam who had experience teaching English as a foreign language. I was one of them, and I don't know who the other one was, but I was just told there were two. And the big shots in the military in Vietnam wanted me to go to this place and teach these Vietnamese pilots. Well, I mean, and it was somewhere on the beach in an old French resort, and I was all ready for it. I thought it would be a fine thing, you know, probably safer than where I was, because Da Nang was known as Rocket City because the number of rockets that came in. Anyway, General Sweeney called me into his office. I was summoned by the king himself. And so I went in, and he was very polite, of course, and to have a seat and blah, blah. And he said, I know there's some talk of you going to Vung Tau to teach Vietnamese pilots. I said, I've heard that. He said, well, let me tell you, you're not going. I said, oh. He said, you're the only person I've had in this job who can write a decent English sentence. You're not going anywhere. I'm keeping you here with me. I said, thank you, sir. And so that was the end of that. But anyway.
Yeah.
So the thing is, if you're in the Army, don't do a good job. You'll pay for it.
If I may ask, you said you had to go, like the assignment was supposed to be for you to teach Vietnamese pilots. What
Yes.
was the need? Why was there the need to teach them
Okay.
English?
The need was that they were supposedly, or they were, being trained to take over from Americans.
Oh.
And so they were going to replace American pilots. I believe that's the story. Mm-hmm. Also, I'm sure they were American-made helicopters, and so they came with English instructions and all kind of things like that, as if I would have known anything about a helicopter machinery or whatever. Press that button and it goes, press that button and it comes down. But as I said, I taught medical students in Saudi Arabia, not because I knew anything about medicine, because I knew something about English.
Mm. Thank you. I also had a question about, so I know you said you had sort of, you know, through the letters, you could sort of hear about the experiences of the recruits in Vietnamese, but did you have any sort of like personal relationship or, you know, sort of like conversations with other people who...
I mean, I had to get these people who had written the letter to come to where I was and talk to me about, explain the problem. And of course, we had to also check to see what the commanding officer, if he's complaining about his commanding officer treating him unjustly, we have to talk to the commanding officer and to the soldier. Of course, I was always on the side of the soldier, but you know, that could not appear in the letter. Anyway, so what was the question again?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, like, if you had
oh yes,
relation
with the people would come in. Yes, I mean, I would be as nice to them as possible. They were perfectly nice to me, because we were all GIs in the same boat, being over here where we didn't want to be, doing a job we didn't want to do, for reasons we didn't fully understand, and I still don't. But that's neither here nor there. So yeah, and some of them, when they I have to tell you another story about Vietnam. Remind me, it has to do with the PX. Okay. Anyway, but some of the people that came in to talk to me, we did become friends, and when they had in-country leave, they'd come back and we met and so forth. Yeah. So yes, there were some. Okay. Now, probably in my first week in Vietnam, and I'm in the place, and of course, you know what a PX is?
No, I don't.
A PX it's called the post exchange.
Okay.
And it's where people they exist all over in military facilities. And it's where, it's like a supermarket, but the things are much cheaper than they would be at Publix or on the regular store. And only members of the military are allowed to shop in these places. So if you know somebody who's in the military or has access to this. Tell them, you can get cheap peanut butter, and the same brand you pay $5 for at Publix might be $1.50 there. Okay, all right. And it's a great big building, the one that I'm talking about in Vietnam. By the way, in Vietnam, I worked in a place called China Beach, which used to be the name of some sort of TV show about Vietnam, which was nothing like the real thing. Anyway, I was in the PX wandering around, curious to see what they had there. And it was like an American supermarket. They had all kinds of things. And they had beer and wine and whiskey, all that stuff as well. And I was walking looking, and I saw this man, young man, who probably I was 2 years older than he was. Anyway, and he was wearing clothes that obviously meant he had been out. He had not been working in an office job. They were torn and dirty, and anyway, he was in the infantry. Okay. And he said, excuse me. I said, yeah. He said, are you over 21? Are you 20? What's your age? Well, I'm just in a supermarket. A stranger come up and asked, which I didn't understand what was going on. I said, yeah, I'm over 21. He said, would you buy me some drink? I said, I didn't understand what was going on. And he said, I'm only 19. I can't buy drink. I can kill people, but I can't get drunk. And forget it. Anyway, so yeah, of course, happily buy you a drink or whatever. And almost every time I went into the PX, there would be a GI hanging around getting people to buy. I never heard of anybody refusing to buy them. If you want a drink, sure, you're suffering much more than I am. I'll happily buy you a drink. Or they would give you the money to buy the drink, but you had to be the one who actually went through the cashier. Anyway, yeah, that was another contradiction and thing. I mean, it's just anyway.
So many. You mentioned when you came back to the U.S. afterwards, like you said you were disillusioned. What was that like for you? I know you said you later had to, travel to, see your friends just so you could, how did that, coming back to the society, what was that experience like for you?
Well, I was already in a very hostile state of mind after having been in Vietnam. Now, I met some wonderful people in Vietnam, but of course, the bottom line is always, Mosunmola, why were we there? Doing what? For whom? That was always the subtext of everything. And there were no satisfactory answers. Why don't you sit in that chair? You're going to fall asleep, Deborah. Well, I'll tell an off-color story and wake you up.
Yeah, by the way, you can say there's no, censors.
I know. Well, I have said what I wanted to say. Now, back to your question. Yeah, and I had some arguments with people in my family, mainly my mother, who wanted to say, now it's time for you to get a job and settle down or go to graduate school or whatever it was. Anyway, and I did not feel, my ideas were not compatible with many of the people around me, and I wanted to get away. And so I did. I used my friend John and his wife, who very kindly invited me to London, and she even got me a job in a hotel, working illegally, of course, but never mind about that. Never had any trouble. But, and I found out that people lived perfectly happy lives without knowing all kinds of junk that happens here. It happens everywhere, but I mean, in those days, you didn't get quite as much of it. Now, when something happens anywhere, it's immediately in the news. And I don't know if that's good or bad. We want to know, but do we have to? Initial reaction, you may, once you've had time to think, you may have a different reaction to things.
And what were some of those ideas? You said you had like different ideas with like.
Well, I mean, I thought I'd made that clear with Vietnam. We're here taking orders from the government, and we have to do certain things in order to get out alive and with an honorable discharge and all that. And there were some people who thought, we're here to kill communists. Oh, well, I mean, war by definition means killing, right? And if you're calling some people communists, how do I know they are and how do I know they aren't? Because, I mean, Vietnam had a whole history. You're too young to remember. Deborah might be old enough to know. There was a whole history of deceiving the American public and the government not being truthful with them. And that made it, you know, I was brought up to think people in authority were doing the right thing. No, Benjamin, wake up. They aren't always doing the right thing. And they're not always telling you the truth. And so I became very cynical. One of my uncles said, I don't see how somebody as young as you got to be so cynical. But yes. I said, do you disagree? He said, no. So, but he was much older than I was. Anyway.
And yeah, and then you moved to London and you got the job in the Middle East and all of that. I know you've talked extensively about like your experience in, you know, the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and Qatar too as well. Is there any other thing that you would like to add about, you know, that phase of living in the Middle East?
Well, the one good thing about living in the Middle East are the salaries were good, and a lot of places were very close. I mean, if you look around, there's a lot of stuff in here from India and Egypt and whatever. And there's that rug, that's an Afghan rug, actually. But I mean, on holidays, you were close enough to India. I liked India, so I went there a lot. I also liked Yemen before the war, and I went there a lot. And, you know, just a short plane ride away. Whereas if you're going from the States, it's, you know, 12, 14 hours. And so I enjoyed the travel. And a lot of other, I mean, there were a good number of expatriates, people working in Saudi Arabia, who, you know, from all over the world. And it was nice to get to know them. And, you know, there are other ways of doing things than the American way. But so many people think the American way is the only way and the right way. Did you record that? I'm afraid you did.
Yeah, so I know you've talked extensively about, you know, what you picked up from like different cultures, but are there other things you learned from your travels across like different countries of the world?
Well, as I said, people are basically, it's easy to get along with them if you treat them well and are polite and thoughtful. Now, if you go rushing in like the stereotypical American in a loud Hawaiian shirt. I've got some, but I'm not wearing them. You know, oh, what's the matter with this place? You can't get a cup of coffee. There's no ice in the tea. All this kind of stuff. So, I mean, in the great scheme of things, does that really matter whether there's ice in the tea? I mean, when I lived in New England for about a year and a half, writing some curriculum for English language teaching in Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm from the South. Iced tea is a staple of life. Not up there. It was in Massachusetts. Goes into a restaurant. Oh, could I have some iced tea? No, it's after Labor Day. We don't serve iced tea after Labor Day. Okay, all right. I mean, but I remember being on the metro in Paris, and I think John was with me, but there were some Americans on there, and they're always talking loudly in English, which of course probably not many people on the metro could understand, thank God, because they were saying crazy things. And well, let's hurry up and get back to the hotel. They got CNN. I want to watch whatever the football game was or whatever. Okay, here you are in Paris, and you want to watch a football game. Why'd you come? Why don't you stay at home where you could watch a football game? I didn't say anything, of course. But I'm not always tolerant of my fellow Americans. Not that I think they're right sometimes, but they're not right all the time.
So talking about like your career life generally, what would you consider to be some of the significant accomplishments from your teaching and sort of like your experiences in your career?
Well, I'm not vain enough or stupid enough to think that I made a lot of difference. I was an English teacher. I tried to teach students English, of course, but when I was in Malawi, I learned a lot of their language. I'm not fluent. And when I was in Saudi Arabia, I learned a lot of Arabic. I'm not fluent in Arabic, but I can carry on a conversation, provided you don't want to discuss the fine points of Islamic jurisprudence or something like that. But I couldn't carry on that conversation in English with a lawyer. But I hope. I certainly learned much. Any teacher will tell you this, I think, a good teacher, that you learn more from your students than they ever learned from you. And it was certainly true about Saudi Arabia or Malawi either. And I did learn, one thing I remember happened in Malawi, and I wasn't really attuned to it at the time. Of course, in retrospect, I can say, you might disagree with me, Mosunmola, that one of the great problems in Africa, or maybe it's still, is tribalism, different tribes fighting against each other. And one of my students was a football player, soccer, football in the rest of the world, soccer here. Anyway, and he broke his leg playing soccer. And he was in class. He came to class after he got his leg in cast and whatever, and the class was over. And I said, "Okay, class dismissed." And he was having some trouble getting up, and I said to another student, "Could you help him?" And the one who had the broken leg said, "I don't want him touching me. He's a Chitumbuka. He's from another tribe." Well, I had no way of knowing anything about that, but it planted the idea in my mind, and then I started looking and noticing, and yes, that was true. It was. I don't know whether it's still true all over Africa, but at one time it was a terrible problem. People are different from me. They don't eat what I eat. They don't pray like I pray. They don't believe like I believe. They don't love like I love. They don't, what does that mean? That just means they're different. And you can learn from them.
Thank you.
Have I ranted long enough?
No, we've been enjoying this so far. I've been having a great time. Yeah. Is there anything you want to share with us in Arabic quickly? Just one.
Yeah.
What?
Would you like to say anything in Arabic for us? One sentence,
you
maybe?
speak Arabic? Okay.
You could tell us the meaning.
Oh, yeah, well, okay. All right, let's see. Of course, I can't think of a thing now. It's always the way. Let's see.
Yeah.
Well, if I were coming into a group of if I'm coming to a group of Arabs, the first thing I would say to them would be "Salam alaikum," which of course it means peace be on you, and they would answer "Alaikum assalam." The one coming says that to the ones who are already there. Let's see what else. And Arabic has a lot of different things that we don't have in English. For example, if I were to say, "Well, I'm going to eat something now," in Arabic you would say that person would answer "bil afia," which sort of means and may be a good meal or something like that. You know, okay, you're going to eat? Okay, eat. Let's see. Okay. عشت في السعودية أكثر من 30 سنة وتعلمت كثير. I lived in Saudi Arabia more than 30 years and I learned a lot. Okay,
That's great.
And if you got any Arab students, I'd love to meet them and practice my Arabic because, you know, with Arabic, with any language, if you don't use it, you lose it. And I mean, I have many times been thinking of something to say in Arabic, and I knew at one time I knew the word, but now I have to go to the dictionary and look it up. But it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, normal conversation stuff, how are you and all that stuff, kef halik. And of course, with the Arabs, it's not just kef halik, it's how are you? How are your children? How's your family? Now, you wouldn't ask, how's your wife? But you might say, how's the mother of your children? Very. And one of the things that impressed me, or seemed really strange to me, for example, I remember in Doha, now these were the days when Doha was not like it is today. It was a little fishing village, little fishing town on the Persian Gulf. And by the way, don't ever say Persian Gulf to Arabs. And they say Arabian Gulf. And don't say Arabian Gulf to Iranians because they will tell you it's Persian Gulf. But the map makers got around it by just calling it the Gulf. So everybody can enjoy it. Anyway, okay, I met a student of mine in Qatar. They were all adults. And this particular one was an older man who, I mean, he was in his 40s or 50s, older at that time. I was in my 20s, anyway. And somebody was with him who was completely covered up in black. And it didn't twig on me. I thought she's with him. Well, she was with him. It was his wife. But if you meet an Arab like that, you talk to the husband. You don't say a word to the wife. You completely ignore her, which growing up in the South was terribly rude. How could you ignore this person, you snob? But anyway, no, that was the way. Later on, of course, I learned that if the woman knew you, maybe you had been to their house and had a meal with them, not with the women, but with the husband and male children, she might say, and how are you? Or she would, if she initiated a conversation, it was okay, but I must not act like I know her because that's forbidden. Anyway. I'm sure you must have encountered some of that in Nigeria.
That's an interesting culture, I would say. Yeah, I think, yeah, for some, yeah, it could be, especially in northern part of Nigeria with the religion and all of that. Yeah.
Very strict. But I think Saudi Arabia has changed a lot in the past 10 years with this crown prince. I mean, women can drive now. For one thing, when I was there, they couldn't drive. And anyway, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's come back to, after you left the Middle East and got back to the US, you mentioned that, you were a little bit ill and,
No, I
had to
was
go
very
through,
ill.
okay.
I was very ill.
You were very ill and you had to go through treatment. What sort of support did you have during that time?
When I was coming back from Saudi Arabia, John, the friend, was living in Australia, and he met me in London, and we flew back here together. And a good friend of mine in Georgia, whose family name actually is Proctor.
Ah.
I don't know if you know, there are a lot of Proctors in Cadman County, but anyway, but her name is Anyway, we have been friends since childhood friends. Our parents are friends. Our grandparents were even friends. Anyway, I went to. She said, "Come to my house," because I had sold the house that we lived in Woodbine, and I was sick. I couldn't have taken care of myself anyway. And so John was with me, and she offered her house, where I ended up staying for far too long, but that's another story. And they were the ones who got me into the VA. I was too sick to do anything. I really was terribly sick. And they got me to the VA here in Gainesville. And anyway, and the rest is history. And then so really, my coming back from Saudi Arabia, I was sick from the beginning. I mean, and I had cancer. I had lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I think it's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I always forget. Let me look.
Okay.
I've got it written down here so I can remember. I'm crazy, you know it. Hodgkin's lymphoma, yes. Oh, she was left with my chair. I walked out of the frame. I'm glad I was able to jump up so quickly. Anyway, and so we reached a point where I needed to be in Gainesville to be near the doctors. And so then we started looking around for a place, and this was the place. Mm-hmm. So that's how so purely medical reasons coming to Gainesville. Mm-hmm. And if you look at my calendar, you see that it's an important part of my social life, going back and forth to doctors. But chemo was horrible. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody unless they wanted to live. But it did the job. It got rid of the cancer, and the cancer has not come back. I've been cancer-free for over 10 years. Mm. So that's...
In what year did you return back to the U.S.?
Well, I'm just trying to think, make it sure. I returned to the U.S. at the end of 2010.
Oh, okay.
And then I moved down here in 2013, in the early part of the year.
Yeah, let's talk about retirement community now. And, I know you mentioned that you moved here largely because of, medical reasons.
Well, that was it. I didn't know anybody here.
But
I'd never heard of the place.
I was going to ask if you considered any other,
Well, I mean, there's another place here, Oak Hammock, where you have to put down $1 million or something to live there. And here, it's like an apartment. You rent it, and you pay the rent, and that's it. You don't have to pay $1 million to get in. I'd be homeless if I had to do that.
And so you've been at the village for almost 10 years now?
Well, this is the 11th year. Oh. But you have to remember, I was supposed to die after 3 years, but I didn't. So I should be a poster child for some doctors here. But no, there are interesting people here. There are people who share my viewpoints. There are people who don't share my viewpoints. And the food is edible. They provide me I can't drive. I have a bad shoulder, which we didn't even get into, but never mind about that. Anyway, and yeah, I like this place.
Would you like to talk about, your shoulders, if you would like to?
I mean, the shoulder. I started chemo in 2012. Okay, and after I had been having chemo for, I suppose, I had chemo for 6 months every 2 weeks. I'd come to Gainesville and they'd do an infusion and whatever. Anyway, and I was staying with this childhood friend and her partner. And anyway, I started chemo, I think, the end of April. I'm not sure, but I know when this happened. This happened on July the 14th. And what happened was I was standing up. We were about to get something out of a closet. And the next thing I knew, I woke up. I was on the floor looking at the ceiling with a strange feeling in my shoulder. What had happened was what medically they call, I think, syncope. There was not enough oxygen getting to my brain, and I fainted. Okay. Now, when you're having chemo, it affects your bone marrow. And of course, a broken bone, you need some. Anyway, there was really nothing they could do except put it in a sling, which they did. And it did not heal exactly the way I would have wanted it to, so that I can use it for whatever, computer or eating, or I can't, this is the good arm. This one I can't go any higher than that. I don't have full range of motion, and the doctors recommended that I not drive because you can't have the full range of motion that you need to drive. Okay, and that was one of the reasons I came here, because this place, I think now most retirement communities do provide a certain amount of transport to and from doctor's appointments, because there are a lot of people here who can't drive. There are a lot of people here who are driving who have no business driving, but that's another story, and they know it.
Okay, so...
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what are some of your favorite things to do here at the village? What do you do typically?
Well, I mean, people here tend to socialize by at meal times, and I never read anything, of course, as you can see. Look around. Reading, and I'm a member of a book club here. They have a book club. And there are some various things, like people discussing current events. There are some, there's a series where we look at great art of the Western world, not the African world or the Asian world, the Western world. There are a number of things to do here. If people are bored, it's their own fault. If they're complaining there's nothing to do, they're full of it. Because there's plenty. There's more to do than you can do. I can't do it all. I mean, but it's okay. It's a nice place to live. And of course, the residents have things to say about the administration, but I'm sure the administration has things to say about the residents. But, we get on. It's fine.
And is there anything that could perhaps be possibly improved on, or?
Well, everything could be improved on, Mosunmola. Except me, of course. No. Oh. Deborah, turn that machine off. No.
We'll cut this out.
You can cut that out.
Yeah.
When I go on a wild rant, you better cut that out. Okay. What was the question again?
I just asked if there's anything that could, possibly be improved on here. Like,
Well, they could reduce the rent. Everybody would say that.
And then, what was your experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how did it affect your work?
Well, we were on lockdown. Everything was closed. There were no activities. We were wearing masks. They had people do our shopping for us. We were allowed to walk outside, but people, it's hard to, at the time, we knew nothing about this sickness. It was just killing people. And it was very sort of strenuous. But they took good care of us, and meals were brought to us from the kitchen. We didn't, nothing was going on where people were mixing, like art, a piano concert or a musical or any sort of thing where all activities were stopped. People, there were some strict rules that I don't remember about who could visit you, and sometimes even your family wasn't allowed. It was not a pleasant time, but we could walk. We weren't stopped from socializing with one another. You could walk out like where I met you down there and sit down there. People would come and you would talk and whatever, and you could go outside and walk around out there, usually with a mask. Now I think you don't need a mask when you're outside, I don't think. I have a mask somewhere on a chair here, I think maybe on that one, which I sometimes wear if I go to Publix, but we didn't go to Publix. All those off-campus things, the only thing, your doctor's appointment you could go to, and of course you went to the hospital and you had to wear a mask, and the doctor had to wear a mask. I said, that's a good time to go to the dentist, wear a mask. You get out without paying anything. Anyway, but no, they handled it well, and they brought the Alachua County Health people here and gave us the vaccinations. So that worked.
Okay. Moving on to the final section of the interview about your reflections and advice. I think the first question is, what are you most grateful for?
Well, right now I'm most grateful for that I got to this place, which is comfortable, suits me, and I have easy access to the doctors, my doctors.
And
now you realize if I were 30, I wouldn't give you that same answer.
I agree. And what do you look forward to the most?
What do I look forward to the most? I can't say getting out of here, because I think there's only one way out. Oh dear, no. Well, I have a lot of cousins and things, and I'm in touch with them, and they come to see me, and sometimes I go to see them, but I've rather reached the point where I'm better off to stay here than to travel somewhere. I mean, I might travel to Jacksonville or Tampa or somewhere near Orlando, but I'm not getting on a plane and going somewhere. I have a bad back or lower back problems that have just become a problem, and I couldn't sit on an airplane for 7 or 8 hours. Anywhere I want to go is far away, too far to think about it.
And what advice would you give to the younger generation based on your experience generally?
They wouldn't take it, so why should I waste my breath?
But I think you should give it, though.
You should give it. Well, I mean, it's a cliche, but I would say, first of all, the younger generation, Western people, you should first of all realize how fortunate you are to have a choice. In much of the world, you don't have a choice. you're stuck in whatever it was you were born into. I mean, all those people in India, their fathers were farmers, subsistence farmers, their grandfathers, they're going to be, their children are going to be. I mean, one of the things that sets us in the West apart from Africa and parts of Asia is that we do have choice. Most of us can make a choice. I mean, I chose to study a certain thing and to do a certain thing, and I enjoyed it, and I was lucky to have that choice. But I'm by no means unaware that a lot of people don't have that choice. Now, okay, so you have a choice. How do you know that you're going to make the right choice? Well, you don't know that, and you will make wrong choices. That's human nature. Mm. But let's hope you can learn from your bad choices.
Thank you for sharing that. And is there any other advice about retirement you would like to give?
You don't retire. But no, you have to at some point.
I think we're coming to the end of the interview now. Is there anything else you'd like to share or add?
Well, I can't think of anything. Of course, when you leave, I will immediately think of everything. But I'm trying to think, is there anything I need to mention? Mm. No, I mentioned everything on my list, which are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. We talked about all of that. Mm. Turn it off, Deborah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ben. And it was great, having this conversation with you. I had a great time.
At one time when I was in Vietnam, this was in the early 70s, there were fights. I don't want to say a riot. It wasn't a riot. Fights between white and black American GIs, American soldiers. So one incident happened quite near where I was. And I mean, I knew black GIs and I knew white GIs, and as long as they gave me a joint, I was happy. I didn't care what color they were. Anyway, maybe you should cut that out. Okay, but some reporters from the New York Times. This was not publicized in the U.S. Remember, this is before Facebook, and where you'd have known about it the same day it happened. It was not the case. Some people. I did know a black guy who was injured, and not killed and not severely injured, but he was injured in an altercation with whites. Anyway, and some reporters from the New York Times were coming to investigate this. They had heard about it, okay? And they had permission from the high-up authorities to come. And one day I went into work around this time, and the captain who was in charge, the same one who said answered the allegations, said, "You can take the day off, and tomorrow too." Well, I mean, what am I going to do? It's not like there was something to do. I was there. We were on the beach, so you could always go to the beach. And I said, "Well, what's happening, sir?" And he said, "The New York Times reporters are coming here, and I'm giving you a direct order. You're not to speak to any of them." So I took my little bag of goodies and went to the beach and found some other people who were there. And we had a very nice 2 days sitting on the beach, getting high and not talking to the New York Times reporters. But that's the kind of thing. I mean, they didn't want the story to get out. It was a terrible story. I mean, I don't know how many people were involved. Not a lot, but enough to cause a stir. And this was not Americans and Vietnamese, white and black Americans, pure race. I mean, remember, this was just after all the civil rights business in the 60s. Yeah.
Well, while we're on that, did you ever join any protests or anything like that? the 60s, anything like that?
No, I did. Mainly, probably, I don't think that where I was in those days, there was any protest. I mean, mentally, yes. I supported them with what was going on. I remember when Martin Luther King made his famous speech, I Have a Dream, in Washington. It was in the summer, and I was visiting John in his, where he lived in Camilla, and his grandmother was there. Now, his grandmother was another generation from us, an earlier generation when things had not been so good. But anyway, I remember she was not in favor of what Martin Luther King was saying. John was very strongly in favor of what Martin Luther King was saying. I was not quite as strong as John, but in favor of it. And so, we had different opinions, but we could talk. We didn't hate each other or, whatever. But I don't, and it's probably worth saying, I never went to school with black people when I was growing up through high school, even through college. When in Emory at Oxford, there were some people from South America, not even anybody from Africa. I don't think there was nobody. It was a small college and part of Emory, but there were no. I never went to school with black people as a student. Now, I went to school with some crazy people, but they weren't black. You can't blame the craziness on that.
That's interesting. Yeah. I just wanted to ask about the incident between the black and white soldiers. Do you remember what exactly happened?
Well, I don't remember what caused it, and it wasn't where I was. We heard about it word of mouth from some people who had been there, and it was. I mean, these are 20-year-old men. In their early 20s. They got lots of energy, lots of testosterone, and they're angry, and they get into trouble. I really don't know anything else. As I told you, I was told not to talk to them. I could have found out from the New York Times people, but they were kept well away from me. Not me, but they were. Anyway, yeah. Okay. I would say probably the last 15 years that I was in Saudi Arabia, I don't know how, I can't remember how this happened. A Saudi man who was editor of a newspaper called Arab News, which is the oldest English language newspaper in Saudi Arabia, hired me or paid me to read his writings in English and make any corrections that needed to be made, which I did. And that led to my getting a part-time job at the newspaper, Arab News, and editing, writing, and not writing so much as taking stuff that was written by a non-English speaker, something might have been wrong or whatever, and correcting it. Okay, so yes, but I didn't write anything. Now, when I came back here, when I got here to the village, each of these buildings has a monthly magazine where people can write things, and I've written a lot of stuff about Saudi Arabia and my experiences and whatever for here, in things here. And the man who hired me directly to work at Arab News was the assistant editor, who was at that time Jamal Khashoggi. I presume you know. Do you know that name?
No, I don't.
He is the man who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Did it still not ring a bell?
No.
Okay, well,
Very bad.
When was this?
it happened in 2018. He was a man. He was a Saudi, and you need to Google that. I'll write it down for you.
Sure. Thank you.
I mean, you should know if you're and if you're not interested, you should still know. Remember, I'm a teacher first and foremost.
Yes.
I think we'll go ahead and stop it.
Yeah. Okay.